Today we're going to be talking about nationalism in the Middle East. And just to remind you, nationalism is love or pride in one's country. And what we're going to be studying in the next few lessons is how nationalism was used to actually create new countries. So people are going to be united by language, blood, culture, religion, and they're going to use those ties to create new countries. So I also want to bring your attention to the map of the Middle East. So these countries are considered the Middle East. Now, before we jump into the lesson, I do want to do a little review of where we've come from with this material. So we're going to be looking at in the different historic maps of the Middle East. So we'll start with the 1600s. We'll notice the Safavid and the Ottoman Empire are the two primary empires. And then moving on, we see in 1880s, we see Persia, Ottoman Empire, Egypt, and then this is what we'll be talking about again in a moment, where the borders that are very similar to what we see today were created by the British and the French drawing the borders. So we'll come back to that. We're going to start by talking about the Ottoman Empire. We talked about this previously. At its height, the Ottoman Empire spanned 3 continents. It was a broad range of culture, religion, and language. Some of their recipes for success, had a highly centralized government. Power, whenever it did transfer, it transferred to one person. It was ruled by a single family. They were united by Islam, and it lasted from 1299 to 1922, so it lasted for 623 years. Now, it's not technically the longest lasting empire. The longest lasting is considered the Roman Empire. Historians debate the start date, but they consider it to be 27 BC with Emperor Augustus. And then the western part of the Roman Empire fell in 476, but the Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, which was a continuation of the old Roman one, fell in 1453. So that one is considered the longest lasting. But back to the Ottoman Empire. So it did last a very long time, and there were some factors that contributed to its decline. The first is thinking back to imperialism, stronger countries wanting to take over weaker ones. European powers, this imperialism is going to continue to play a role. They want to expand their empires, so they're actually going to expand into and claim parts of the Ottoman Empire. Something else that we're going to see is the empire faced economic problems. As you can imagine, it would be very expensive to maintain such a large empire. Also, we see the government becoming less centralized. It's important to have a strong central government that can make those decisions, and as we see, it's becoming less centralized, so that was a factor that contributed. There were other factors as well, such as competition of trade from the Americas, competition from products in India and the Far East, development of other trade routes, rising of unemployment, the sultans becoming less sensitive to public opinion, not maintaining rigorous standards and administering the empire, many other factors. But the results of this is Great Britain and France start to make plans to divide the Ottoman Empire territories that are in the Middle East. So again, we've seen these two competing, and imperialism competing for territory, and now they just see the Ottoman Empire as one more place where they can get territory. And then, so what we see is post World War One, a treaty was signed to divide the Ottoman Empire, and really the final nail on the coffin of the Ottoman Empire was the Turkish War of Independence. So the result is that Constantinople fell and Turkey became its own country in 1923. Now, in terms of how the political boundaries were formed in the Middle East, like I mentioned, France and Great Britain are going to be the ones that drew the borders and decide where to draw those borders. And just like we saw with the Berlin Conference in Africa, they're not really going to take into consideration religious differences, ethnic differences. It's more about where can I draw the borders so that I can get the most resources. Now, this is a history of some of the agreements that helped form the borders in the Middle East. So the first is the Balfour Agreement. So this was in 1917, and as part of this agreement, the British promised that they're going to help create a national home for the Jewish people that are in Palestine. The next agreement is the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and this is the agreement that actually was used to draw the borders in the Middle East. Next, we see in 1920 the League of Nations put forth a mandate, and a mandate basically just gave the territories to the French and to the British to govern until they believed that those territories were ready for independence. And just a reminder that League of Nations was the international peacekeeping organization at the time. And the next League of Nations mandate was in 1922. The League of Nations issued a mandate to help establish a national home for the Jews in Palestine. So in 1917, that first agreement, that was just a promise, and now in 1922, this is actual a formal agreement. Now, thinking to present day, what we see is this has created a lot of tension in the region because for the Arab people, they saw this Jewish homeland being created in an area that was 98% Muslim, and so this decision has created a lot of conflict in the region today over not over just territory, but also religious differences and claims to holy lands between these faiths. Here's a map of the Middle East, 1919 to 1935, so post Sykes-Picot Agreement. And then here's another map taking us back to that site. So we can see some of the same countries that we see today. So we see Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Turkey, Syria. And then if we look at a more modern map, we'll notice changes like this has become Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Oman, and United Arab Emirates have been created. What was Palestine is now Israel. So things did change, but we can see for the most part the borders are pretty similar that were created after the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Now the next thing that we need to talk about is the discovery of oil in the Middle East. So in the 1930s, that's when oil was discovered. You might have noticed it on the last map too, oil producing areas. And the effect that this had was we see Western nations, for example, the British, the US, coming in to gain access and gain control of the oil to bring wealth to their own nations. And here's another map of just where oil is located. This region of the world considered the oil corridor, and oil has been used to, in some cases, keep dictators and things in power just because of the wealth that it can sustain them. And then the last thing that I want you to consider is this map, and you can click on the link to this map. This is religious composition of the Middle East, and it's kind of to tell, but the lighter green is Sunni Muslims, the dark green Shia Muslims. Um, we see very sort of like purplish is Christianity, the orange Judaism, the red Zoroastrianism, very small pockets of that. And so what I want you to look at related to this map is, first of all, what do you notice about the distribution of religions in the Middle East? So think about which religions are dominant, things like that. Next, how could this lead to problems within individual countries and within the Middle East, the way that the religions are distributed? And then lastly, I want you to imagine that you've been tasked to redraw the borders in the Middle East in order to create a politically stable and economically self-sufficient countries. So what might you change about the borders, and what might you keep the same? So taking into consideration, maybe you want to make some changes based on how the religious groups are grouped together in a country, things like that. And then a reminder to write your summary, which is 2 to 3 sentences in which you summarize the main ideas of the lesson.